In this video, we're talking about how to be more confident when speaking English in meetings, how to overcome that fear of speaking, and I'm going to give you some great vocabulary and tips that you can use to achieve this. Okay, let's get started with tip number 1. Our first tip today is to speak early. The longer you wait in a meeting to say something, to speak, the more pressure there is going to be and the more difficult you are likely going to find it. If you have a 1-hour meeting and you know that you want to say something, but you wait until the last 5 minutes, then you're going to spend most of that meeting worrying about and thinking about the fact that you want to say something. Another problem is that if you're meeting with native speakers, then they often speak really quickly. They speak really fast. So sometimes when you're thinking of something to say, thinking of a comment that you'd like to make, by the time you've thought of something, the conversation has already moved on. The opportunity has passed. So, speaking in the first 1 or 2 minutes of a meeting can really help to deal with a lot of these challenges. Let's take a look at some native and natural sounding vocabulary that we can use to speak early in meetings. Before we get started, I'd just like to mention. Before we get into anything, I'd just like to say. Before we get into anything, I'd just like to say. I'd just like to jump in early and say. I'd just like to jump in early and say. Just quickly before we get moving, can I mention? Just quickly before we get moving, can I mention? Now, as you can probably hear with all of these pieces of vocabulary, you need to decide what you're going to say next, what your actual comment or your question is going to be. So a little bit of preparation, a little bit of work before the meeting to decide what you'd like to say in those first couple of minutes, what you'd like to jump in and comment on would be a great idea. Let's take a look at some key vocabulary from those examples. And let's look at the phrasal verb jump in, to jump in. So what does this mean and when can we use it? To jump in is a really nice way to announce that maybe you're not expected to speak now, but you'd like to. It's often a really good way to interrupt someone politely. Also, our next video on this, part 2, is going to have a lot more detail, vocabulary, and ideas on interrupting politely. So look out for that. So we could use this in the past tense. For instance, Dave jumped in while we were discussing that and told us it probably wouldn't be a good idea. Or in the continuous tense, for instance, thanks for jumping in and letting us know. That's really useful information. So this is the phrasal verb to jump in. Just quickly before we move on to tip number 2, I want to jump in and say that if you are enjoying this video, if it's useful for you, then I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and maybe while you're there, subscribe. That tells YouTube that this is a useful video with good information in it, and it sends that out to other people. I'd really appreciate that. Okay, let's move on to tip number 2 today, and that is to make small contributions. If you are nervous about speaking for 10 or 20 seconds on a subject, then it can really help to start by just saying a couple of words. This can get you over this fear of speaking in meetings and into the habit of saying things and contributing during your English language meetings. The great thing about making small contributions is that by the time you've started speaking, you've almost already finished. There are 2 really easy and great types of small contribution that you can make. Number 1 is to give a compliment, and number 2 is to agree with an idea or to agree with what someone has said. This is because if you agree with someone, you're more likely to get a response like, "Thanks," or "I'm glad you agree." If you disagree, then you're probably going to be asked why, and you'll need to speak a bit longer and explain yourself. So, let's take a look at some great small contributions that you can make in your next meeting. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I agree, 100%. I agree, 100%. Thanks for filling us in. Thanks for filling us in. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. Okay, we had 2 great pieces of vocabulary here. One was thanks for filling us in. So this is the phrasal verb to fill somebody in. And we also had the idiom to bring us up to speed, to bring someone up to speed. What do these mean? Well, often when we use the phrase to fill something in, we're talking about a form. Maybe you need to write out your name, age, date of birth, address. You put this information into a document, into a form. We use this same idea to talk about giving information to people. So, if you're giving information to someone, usually important, relevant information that often you've only just recently found out or learned, then we can use the phrasal verb to fill in. For instance, Dave filled us in before the meeting, so we know exactly what's happening. Dave filled us in before the meeting, so we know exactly what's happening. Or, in the continuous tense, hey, thanks for filling me in. I really appreciate it. Thanks for filling me in. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's take that last idiom there to bring someone up to speed. Well, if you're driving along in the car and maybe your friend is driving along too, if they come up to speed with you, then you're kind of in the same place. You're making the same amount of progress. So to bring someone up to speed means that you have information about something which is in progress and you're giving it to them. For instance, Dave brought us up to speed before the meeting, so we know everything that's happening today. Dave brought us up to speed before the meeting, so we know everything that's happening today. Or maybe, thanks for bringing us up to speed. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions about the vocabulary or any of the ideas in this video, then leave a comment down below. I'm always happy to answer questions and reply to comments. This video is part 1 of a 2-part series about confidence when speaking in meetings. I'll link part 2 right up here, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.